happy to help anyone, of course, who comes in, but researchers who know what they are looking for and where the information might be make our lives easier, make our work easier. So I appreciate it. It's wonderful. You've probably already read about her qualifications, so now I'll just let her share the results of her careful research. So Emily, yeah, thank you for coming.
I'm going to sit down tonight because of a disability. I think some of you have been at my talks before. Well, I know many of you have been at my talks before, and you know I have to sit down. And I want to thank the library staff here, and especially Elizabeth and also Jill Craig in the back there, for the years of painstaking help they've given me on my various projects. And particular with the book that is coming out on May 31st, of which this is a part. So thank you. Thank you, Western Maryland Room and Western Maryland Regional Libraries. This is, I could not have done this work without the help that I've received here. And the patient willingness to search for things that I couldn't find. So tonight I'm going to talk about a Black family, an African-American family that witnessed the events of the Civil War and participated in the events of the Civil War here in Washington County and in Frederick County. And that family is the Ridout family, the family of the Reverend Daniel Ridout, who was born free and then was apprenticed and as a child. And so he lived a life as a young person that was very similar to being enslaved, but he was freed from his apprenticeship, which meant in Maryland at that time for a Black child, basically enslavement. He was freed at age 18. He married a young free woman named Eliza Carr. She died early in their marriage, and then he remarried another free woman. Both of his wives were free-born women. So this was a free family. And I have a diagram here where I use silhouettes because we don't have, except for this portrait of Daniel, the Reverend Daniel Ridout, we do not have any photographs, or I do not have. I have not been able to find any photographs of members of this family. So I'm using some silhouettes here to sort of walk you through who the members of this family were. I just pulled these silhouettes off the internet. And in the center, you see somebody representing the Reverend Daniel. And over on the left, his wife seated, his first wife Eliza, and their first two children, James and Catherine, who would be teenagers at the time of the Civil War. And then they also had a baby named Margaret who died in infancy. And then Eliza died, so I'm taking them off the screen. And then he remarried. He married a woman named Caroline. And they had two children, young Archie, I've got to get my pointer here, Archie, and they had a child named Martha Ann, who was a little older than Archie, a daughter named Martha Ann. Tonight, our narrator and our informant about these events will be Archie. Archie was the person who wrote this all down, who wrote their family history down. Inadvertently, really, he wrote a biography of his father, Reverend Daniel Ridout, after the Reverend Daniel died in the 1880s. And so we have their story because Archie Ridout wrote it down. And briefly, I'll just show you also where they lived and worked. Reverend Daniel, early in his ministry, was assigned to a number of different circuits in Maryland, A.M.E. Preaching circuits. And early on, he was assigned to the Frederick and Washington County circuit, which you see in this circle. I've just put the circles and ovals up to sort of indicate where they are. That was Frederick County and Eastern Washington County here. So in 1858 and 1859, for 2 years, he was on that circuit. Then for 2 years, he was switched over to the Cumberland Circuit, which included Eastern Allegheny County and Western Washington County. And in that time, First, I believe they lived in Frederick County, but in 1860 they lived in Cumberland, 1861 they lived in Hancock, and then he was switched back to this circuit and they lived outside Burkittsville. And I'll talk more about where they lived in Burkittsville later on. So let's go right to the events that are described in this wonderful source material that Archie produced, because this is what really made this talk possible and made this a wonderful source for me to use when I was doing this research. It's unique material that is just, there's nothing else like it in this region. No other Black person wrote a sustained narrative, or any narrative really, of what happened to them during the Civil War. And I'm gonna take questions at the end of the talk, if that's okay. I'm gonna ask you, there's gonna be, I think, a lot of questions occurring to you, so if you wouldn't mind holding your questions till the end, that would be great. So let's begin with the events of these years, and I'm going to have some just illustrations to make you to help keep your attention on the screen that are related to what I'm talking about, and I'll have a few quotes up there, but I will be reading longer quotes that these are part of. Archie Ridout tells us that 1859. I'm a medieval historian, so sometimes I just say 1159 out of the blue. By training, for many years I was working with the Middle Ages. So if I drop back into the 12th century, please forgive me. So Archie tells us that 1859 was a challenging year for his father. And I'm going to read a brief piece here. He says, "If the previous year had been a hard one, this was harder still, for it was the year of the John Brown insurrection at Harper's Ferry. It caused a great deal of excitement in Western Maryland. Every prominent Black man was looked upon suspiciously. He, his father, he traveled his work, however, without being molested," end quote. And other sources, other Black sources from this region tell us how revered John Brown was in the Black community. And it's very specific. I've found a number of Black sources who talk about how excited they were to have had contact with John Brown, or looking back from years later, they speak of John Brown's saintliness and how inspiring he was, and how important he was. So although Archie doesn't talk about that, he does talk about the difficulties that the raid caused because white people cracked down on Black people. White sources tell us how tense the authorities were. They drummed up extra police patrols and militia regiments here in this region. And then, of course, in 1860, the Maryland legislature abolished manumission. There would be no more freeing of slaves in Maryland after June of 1860. That was a crackdown caused by the fear engendered by John Brown's raid. So we move on to April of 1861. And April was the year that the A.M.E. church reassigned its preachers. Usually they didn't stay in a circuit for more than 2 years. So April of 1861, of course, is also the beginning of the Civil War. And Archie mentions that the war made it unsafe for Black men to gather together in assemblies. And it was difficult for the A.M.E. to hold its annual conference in Baltimore that year, for the Baltimore regional gathering. He writes, "As war had unsheathed its sword and the times were critical, it was unsafe for a body of colored men to meet together." And so he's referring here to the A.M.E. conference. But he continues that for his father, 1861, what I'm quoting here, was a year of sorrow, danger, and scarcity. Daniel Ridout, the Reverend, had fightings without and fears within. He's quoting a hymn there. He says, "The war had begun in earnest, the country was upside down, and he faced many dangers while traveling from one point to the other. Whenever he left home, he was always cautioned by my mother to be very careful." So here's Archie remembering the stresses of that time and remembering his mother always saying to his father, be careful out there. He also mentions sorrow. He mentions it was a year of sorrow, and that's because in June of 1861, one of the children died in this family. Young Martha Ann Ridout died of a fever, we're told, a fever. She was about 5 or 6 years old. And Archie talks about this in his father's biography. Quote, "Father was not at home at her death or burial, and there was no way possible to get word to him in time. There was no telegraph office in the town. Indeed, just then, very few telegrams were sent by colored people. I, a boy of 4 years, thought it strange that sister should be put in a hole and covered up. She was laid to rest in a corner of the white folks' cemetery. When father returned, he was almost prostrated over the death of his favorite child." End quote. And, just reading this now, it just struck me that I've been working with Elizabeth Paul there at the Halfway Cemetery, which is an African-American cemetery dating from this time period that we're talking about, from the 19th century into the 20th century. And so many of the names that we've found through research of the people buried at Halfway, we have almost 300 names so far. So many of them are children. They're little children like this. They're infants or young children. And this is their story, that nothing could be done. And here, Reverend Ridout was away from home. He didn't know till he came back from his circuit that she was even sick. And suddenly she's gone. She's just gone. And this was such a common story in our ancestors' lives, all of our ancestors' lives. But for poor people, for Black people, and for enslaved people, which the Ridouts were not, infant mortality was higher. Okay, so the war is on, and by now, and this is Hancock, by the way, I used some images here of the Hancock Cemetery. On the right here, you have the Episcopal Cemetery. I have been told, and others may know better, but I was told a long while ago that the public cemetery in Hancock was just to the east, the west. You can tell I have a problem with east and west. To the west of the Episcopal Cemetery, that this was the public cemetery. And I may be completely wrong about that, but that's what somebody told me once. So, and I wasn't able to find anyone to verify that for me in the run up to this talk. So please feel free to correct me after the formal talk is over. But that may be where she is buried, where Martha Ann Ridout is buried. So by this time, the Union troops were beginning to be stationed in Hancock. And we have a number of illustrations of those that are available. And 4-year-old Archie Ridout was fascinated by them. And so talking here about himself, he writes, quote, "The writer remembers very distinctly the encampment of soldiers near the town. He delighted to see them drill. There were frequent exchanges of shots between the Blues and the Grays. The Potomac River separated them. The Blues were on the Maryland side, the Grays were on the Virginia side. The firing always excited him, and young as he was, he declared he wanted to be a soldier to fight the Rebs," end quote. And when I read this passage, I think of his mother, Caroline Ridout, with this 4-year-old boy who wants to be a soldier, who is fascinated by the soldiers, who's probably trying to sneak off and watch the soldiers and visit the camp and follow the soldiers around. And she has to keep a careful eye on him for his own good, for his safety. And the danger of having soldiers around was real. They were firing live ammunition. They were at war. They were at war with the Confederates who were right across the river. Sorry. In the fall of 1861, the Ridouts are living in Hancock, and they are living next door to an Irish family, the Rokes. And these two families were friendly. Archie described the Rokes as splendid neighbors, but the presence of troops led to danger, and Archie describes one of these incidents. So I'm going to read you this anecdote about the Roke family and the troops, the soldiers. One night, between 12 and 1 o'clock, when the whole town was asleep, a soldier passed the guard and broke into Mrs. Roke's home. What his purpose was, I do not know, but I presume it was criminal. Old man Roke ran and left his family, yelling as he ran, "Corporal of the guard!" We were all awakened. Father jumped up, seized a musket, and rushed out in his nightclothes. Mother rushed out after him in her nightgown, seized him, she was then a powerful woman, brought him back, and made him put down his weapon. It was well she did, or it might have ended seriously. The officers came, and the next day the soldier was punished. End quote. I find this a fascinating story. We see here the close relations between the black and white neighbors. We see that a black family is keeping a musket in their home for whatever reasons, self-defense, probably hunting as well. The Ridouts had to supplement their church income, and we learn that throughout the book. We see a black man rushing to the defense, the armed defense of his white neighbor. And we also see a black woman stopping her husband from clashing with soldiers, and wisely so. The soldiers, they're obviously not a good, it would not have been good. So I just find that a really interesting story. So moving on to 1862. And Archie introduces the events of the next year by saying that the year 1862 was the hardest and most dangerous of any year in his father's ministerial life. And if you know, I'm sure most of you do anything about 1862, this will not be surprising to you. In April of 1862, the Ridout family Daniel Ridout was reassigned to the Frederick and Eastern Washington County circuit. And the Ridout family moved to a location just outside Burkittsville. So this map on the right shows, with the red dot, shows the location where they lived, where their home was. It's about a mile north of Burkittsville. Burkittsville's at the bottom of the map, and this location is about a mile north, as the crow flies. It is just a smidge north of Crampton's Gap. This is South Mountain, and the photograph shows the mountain, the ridge of the mountain, and the red dot shows the location of their home. And here's Crampton's Gap. So those of you who are Civil War people will know what's coming now. Even if you didn't read the title of the talk and just happened to wander in. Archie described it as, quote, a picturesque but lonely spot. And I believe that although you can see it's sort of wooded, and if you look at Arnoldtown Road today, it is wooded. I think they were on Arnoldtown Road. It's pretty clear that's where they were. I don't think it was wooded at the time of the battle. Well, it did not stay lonely. In September of 1862, as many of you will know, the Confederates invaded Maryland. They crossed the Potomac River into Montgomery County and then marched north into Frederick County. And their next step was to cross South Mountain into Washington County. And Archie writes, "One morning we were awakened by shouts and the rumbling of wheels. Arising, we found that the Confederates were all around us. They were pitching their tents and planting their artillery a few hundred yards from our house and were making themselves generally comfortable. Things looked gloomy, I assure you. Father was not at home, and we did not know when he could get home. and as the rebel pickets were scattered all over the mountain, end quote. Now, Daniel Ridout was away on his preaching circuit, and as it happened, he was here in Washington County on the other side of the mountain. So Caroline Ridout had to protect her family in what was at times a very threatening situation. And I'm going to read a bit longer passage here because Archie tells us some of what this week brought about in the family's life, and some of it is quite surprising. This is not an artifact from the Ridout family, but just something I found to illustrate this part of the narrative. So Archie writes, "They," that means the Confederates, "they remained there for a week or more, during which time they were frequent visitors at our house. Mother, who was a courageous Christian woman, showed no signs of fear when they came, and, womanlike, would have her say. A private came in one day and made an insulting remark, whereupon she grabbed him by the nape of his neck and the seat of his gray breeches and fired him out the house. She then put on her bonnet and went directly to the Confederate camp and reported him. The officers made him come and apologize. At night, after committing us to the care of our Heavenly Father, a duty which she never forgot, she would put us to bed and sit up all night with an ivory-handled dirk knife in her hand. During the day, she carried it in her bosom." End quote. So there's a mix here of bravado and watchfulness and maybe fear in Caroline's actions. Now, despite the dangers that his mother recognized in dealing with the Confederates who are basically in their yard, Archie was allowed to fraternize with the soldiers. And he writes about the money he made. And the money he made, quote, "by dipping water from the spring in the end of our garden with a little wooden pail for the rebels to drink. They always paid me in Confederate money, of course." So he didn't make much money. He also writes, "We were all very much worried about Father. His prolonged absence became unbearable, and Mother had concluded to send us, that is the children, to send us to a neighbor's and go in search for him." End quote. So you can just imagine the prospect of Caroline having to search Washington County for her husband in the midst of a Confederate invasion. But meanwhile, on the other side of the mountain, Daniel Ridout, her husband, was trying to get home. He had, of course, heard about the invasion. Everybody in Washington County knew about the invasion, and he knew that the Confederates were in Frederick County and they were spreading up onto the mountain, on the South Mountain. And he made 3 failed attempts to get through the Confederate picket lines before his final successful attempt. But even the successful attempt was harrowing. And these are his words describing getting through the pickets as remembered by his son Archie. So I'm quoting Archie, quoting his father. "I had a hard time to get here. I passed all the guards safely until nearly home, when a sentinel levied his musket at me, telling me at the same time to halt. After answering all his questions, he said sneeringly, 'Darky preacher, eh? Well, pass on.' And so Daniel Ridout came home to his family safely." So Daniel Ridout got home on Saturday, September 13th. And as many of you will know, Sunday, September 14th, the Battle of South Mountain was fought. The family knew that battle was brewing. And Archie recalled, quote, "We were all up at daybreak. No one had appetite for breakfast, except myself." The 5-year-old could eat. And he, at a number of points in the narrative, he points out that the whole family would be tense about something except him. He was fine. So after that statement comes one of what I think is one of the most striking anecdotes, one of the most striking anecdotes in Archie's books, and I'm going to read it just as it stands. After the table had been cleared off, and we were sitting gazing out the windows, a rebel soldier called. He was a young man and made himself very agreeable in conversation with my mother. Said he, "Auntie, we expect a fight here today. The Yankees are coming, and we are going to make it hot as H for them." Said mother, "Yes, and you had better take care of your own precious hide." Then he began to dance and sing. "I wish I was in Dixie, look away, look away. I'll live and die in Dixie, look away." Said mother, "Take care, young man, that you don't die in Maryland." That's the end of that little bit. But remember that young man, because he will come up again. So after this, the battle began. And there are a number of maps of the battlefield of Crampton's Gap that are the way that I have located the Ridout house. I assume that these are drawn from maps drawn at the time of the battle. This one was published in 1887. It's the earliest I have found. I am not a South Mountain expert by any means, and I'm sure there are people in this room who have more expertise than I do. But this one shows in this, I've enlarged this red square here, a house, the Ridout. So I'm assuming that is the Ridout house. And that is where how I've plotted where they live. It meets all the, it accords with everything in the text, the Ridout family text. It makes perfect sense with all the details in the text. So it's located perfectly for seeing, from the northern edge, most of the fighting, a lot of the fighting at Crampton's Gap, especially on the northeastern edge of the fighting. And as many of you will know, the fighting at South Mountain took place in 3 basic locations: the southern pass at Crampton's Gap, and then the 2 northern passes at Fox's and Turner's Gap. But it's Crampton's Gap that Archie writes about. Archie called himself an eyewitness to the battle, and it's clear that the Ridouts witnessed a lot of the fighting from their home, and that is described in the text. So I'm going to read parts of this long section of Archie's text for you without much commentary, because it's just very vivid. So to start, I'm going to quote, Archie writes, "From where their first cannon," this is the Confederate cannon, "from where their first cannon was planted to our gate was not more than 250 yards. Oh, battle scene. "It is now noon. The Yankees, I see them coming, bayonets glistening in the autumn sun. They are nearing the rebel line, coming within range of their larger guns. They cross Mr. Whip's field of recently planted wheat. They are now behind the stone fence. As they scale it, the command is given to the rebels to fire. It seemed as if heaven and earth had collided. The battle now begins in earnest, and nothing is heard but the incessant pop, pop of the musket and the boom of the cannons. Balls fly in all directions. One enters our house and embeds itself in the wall. For safety, we repair to the cellar." Well, until that point, they've been upstairs or in the yard, just watching all this. The basketballs flying. And this is, I think, quite common when you read the civilians' accounts of I have not read many, of course, African-American accounts, but the white civilians at Antietam, they're like, "Oh, gosh, that shell went off right next to my head. I guess I better go down in the cellar." It happens more than you would think. The adrenaline, is that like, "Whoa, battle's happening. Oh, this is interesting. Ooh, dangerous." Then they go. then they should seek cover. Some of them, not all of them. I mean, no experience is universal, but this is not uncommon. So the Ridouts had a cellar. They went down in the cellar, and they watched the rest of the battle from their cellar, which had a window. And they watched for a while, and then the firing, as Archie says, the firing subsides. This is a lull in the fighting around the middle of the battle. And Archie writes, the firing subsides. Father and sister go out in the yard to reconnoiter. This is Daniel Ridout and his 14-year-old daughter, Catherine. And Archie writes, a rebel cavalier is passing by, sees them. Maddened by the fact that the battle is almost lost to them, he aims a pistol at Father, pulls the trigger, but the weapon misses fire. 3 times he aims and pulls the trigger. Each time it only snaps and refuses to kill God's anointed. With an oath, he rides on. End quote. Daniel Ridout and his daughter go back down to the cellar. But it's a serious near miss that they had there, especially Daniel. And I don't think we can think that if this rider had come across a white civilian, he would have done the same thing. So in the second half of the battle, Archie becomes very flowery and excited in how he describes the battle. He says, but look, the cavalry are now engaged. We see them directly in front of our cellar window. Look at these splendid chargers on which the Union cavalry ride. See their distended nostrils. Cavalry. See their distended nostrils. They smell the battle. They paw. They snort. Their very necks seem clothed with thunder. That's a biblical quotation. The Confederate cavalry gives way before the fearful charge. The command is given to the Union soldiers to advance double quick and sweep the field with the bayonet. This is too much for the Johnnies. They run like sheep over the mountain, leaving their dead and wounded behind. The Unions have gained the victory, but it is a dear one. Hundreds of the boys in blue lie dead and dying. End quote. It is now dark. Quoting again. It is now dark. We come up out of our uncomfortable quarters and breathe more freely. None of the family slept that night, except the writer, who was too young to realize the danger through which we had just passed, and who thought the whole thing was simply immense. Next morning, September 15th, the sun arose in all his splendor. Father took us out on the battlefield, the sights of which are now vividly portrayed in my mind, although at the time I was only 5 years old. The dead and dying lay, thick as leaves, upon the ground. A leg here, an arm there, a head here, a foot yonder. Horrible, horrible. The young man to whom I have alluded, and here he means the man who sang Dixie in their kitchen, the soldier. The young man whom I have alluded to was the first dead man we saw, not over 200 yards from our house. He was lying on the public road, on the side of the public road, with a hole in his head into which you could put your fist. That is he, said Father. Yes, said Mother. He died in Maryland. End quote. Three days later came the Battle of Antietam, as many of you know. The Ridouts did not see this battle. They were living, of course, on the other side of the mountain, but like hundreds or maybe thousands probably of people in this region, they heard the Battle of Antietam. And I think it's interesting that in contrast to South Mountain, Archie Ridout wrote almost nothing about the Battle of Antietam. He wrote that it was, the greatest battle of the Civil War, and then he writes, "We visited that battlefield also, but I cannot give a description of it. It was one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War." That's all he says. It's as if he had sort of drained himself in writing about the battle he saw, and then we saw Antietam too. And we saw, that battlefield. And it may be that the carnage at Antietam was just too much to write about. But I've also found that sometimes when I read some of and others of you may have found this too, that when the local eyewitnesses who saw South Mountain, that was the terrible shock to them. That when they saw that battlefield, it was their first. And it was so horrific that in a way it prepared them for Antietam, for seeing the site of the Antietam battlefield. And the Antietam battlefield was the one that shook them. And then it was just more of the same, and horrifically more of the same at Antietam. So Archie does tell us about his church. He says the Federal soldiers were about there, meaning the region of Antietam, for quite a while, meaning after the battle. The home church was taken for a hospital, and there were no religious services held in it for some time, end quote. Now it's not completely clear, it's not clear which church he means. He just says the home church. But it's a very good chance it was this church just outside Burkittsville, which is Ceres Bethel Church, Bethel A.M.E. Church. This is a small and pretty insignificant church compared to some of the others on Daniel Ridout's circuit, but it would have been the church closest to where they lived. And so when he says home church, I think this must be the one he means. Excuse me. It was probably founded by Daniel Ridout because it was founded in 1858 when he was the circuit rider here. And so this was, their church. Now, it was not this building. This building was built in 1870, and it's now derelict. But there is a foundation of the earlier church is on the property. So it's, near Burkittsville, it's in Frederick County, and it's a really historic church. And it was probably used as a Civil War hospital, according to this text. And this is significant because we know that many, many churches in this area were used, and barns and farms and so on were used as Civil War hospitals. That we know that's common knowledge. But we don't have much information about Black churches being used as hospitals. And here is Archie clearly stating that an A.M.E. church was used that way for some time. And that's useful information. It's additional information that we didn't have. And probably it was Ceres Bethel. Okay, so the war went on. In April of 1863, Daniel Ridout was moved again. He was moved away from Western Maryland. He was moved to a circuit in Baltimore County. He was moved to Ellicott Mills, but he moved his family to Baltimore County, Ellicott Mills being Ellicott City. And after that, there's very little in his biography by Archie about the Civil War. But there is one episode of great importance. In 1863, the family's son, James Ridout, enlisted in the newly formed United States Colored Troops, the units of Black soldiers who were made possible by the Emancipation Proclamation in January of 1863. James Ridout actually enlisted in Connecticut, which is a mystery to me. But he enlisted in the 31st United States Colored Infantry. And in 1864, James Ridout was wounded in the foot at the siege of Petersburg, Virginia. He was sent to Louverture Hospital in Alexandria, which was a hospital for Black troops and for the so-called contrabands, the Black refugees who were former slaves who were pouring into the Union territories and into Army camps. This hospital is really interesting, and I obviously can't talk about it tonight, but there's a museum in Alexandria about the history of Louverture Hospital. And one thing I removed from the slide because I didn't think I had time to talk about it, but if any of you are familiar with the book Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs, it's a very well-known, important slave narrative that was published before the Civil War and is still taught in colleges today. Harriet Jacobs was a well-known author at this time, Black author. And she was a relief worker and nurse at this hospital. So it has a connection with a really famous person. And the Ridouts may have met her. James Ridout was there with his wounded foot, and Daniel Ridout went to his bedside. And James Ridout died at Louverture Hospital. Archie writes, "Father was with James when he died. His end was peaceful. He went to reap a soldier's reward." James Ridout is buried at Alexandria National Cemetery, which is a military cemetery, not Arlington, but Alexandria. It's a Civil War military cemetery. There was controversy about this cemetery because at first, the Black soldiers who died at Louverture were buried in the contraband cemetery, the ex-slave cemetery called the Freedmen Cemetery. And as that process went on, the wounded soldiers in the hospital began to protest and say, we, or our brothers here, should not be buried in a segregated Black cemetery with civilians. They are soldiers. We are fighting alongside other soldiers. We are free men, most of us. We are fighting for the United States. We deserve to be buried when we die in a military cemetery. We should be buried in Alexandria Cemetery, which is a military cemetery for white soldiers. We want to be buried there. And they signed a petition and they raised heck about it, and they won their point. And the soldiers the graves that have been in the soldiers' graves that have been in the Freedmen Cemetery were moved into Alexandria. And it seems that James Ridout's grave was moved because he died in November, and this decision was made in, I think, December of 1864. So he is buried in Alexandria, and he has this gravestone there, a military gravestone. That is the last piece of the Ridouts' Civil War history that is known. I do have other Black Civil War stories for this region coming out in my book next month, and a little bit more about the Ridouts before South Mountain. But this is the story that I came here to tell tonight, and that is the sad end with James Ridout giving his life for the cause of freedom, which his family had contributed to. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take questions. Sir.
Yes, please tell us how you found Archie's autobiography of his father and where it is, or what.
Yes, I'd be happy to. So I'd like to say the mysterious process of research, but it's actually online. It's digitized or photographed by the Hathi Trust, which is similar to Google Books. So if you Google Reverend Daniel Ridout, you'll come up with it, and it's there and free for all to read. But I didn't find it by Googling Daniel Ridout because I didn't obviously know who he was until I read his book, Archie's book. I found it in a footnote, or through a footnote, or a mention and a footnote in the excellent book, Too Afraid to Cry by Kathleen Ernst. And she did not use the book, but she made a reference to a Black preacher doing something or other. She used a little snippet of information from it. And she cited in the footnote, if I remember correctly, another, I think, 19th century author citing it. And I thought, well, I have to track this down. So I did, and I'm surprised that she didn't use it, and I think it must not have been digitized and available to her, because I can't imagine that she wouldn't have used it, because she is an excellent researcher, and her book is so good. And I think she would have wanted to use it if she had known it existed or had access to it. So I think it must have been digitized after she did her research and wrote her book. And if you haven't read her book, you should, because it's very good. Isn't it good? Yeah, it's very good. So, I aspire to do what she did, but for the Black community, about the Black community during the same time.
Stresses what actually happened to civilians.
Right.
As a result of that.
Right, so her book is called Too Afraid to Cry, and it's about the civilians during the Maryland campaign, Lee's invasion of this region in 1862.
Am I wrong in making the assumption that one of the reasons why, actually when the battles first started at this stage of the game, shall we say, actually after A.M.E was the first time they really started using photographs and people started realizing how horrendous
Yes.
the battle, in other words, it became more advertised what battle really was.
Yes.
Before it was, Johnny goes marching out.
Yes, so now you're starting to ask Civil War questions, but there are undoubtedly people in this room better qualified to answer this than I am, but I'm going to say my understanding is also that the exhibition of photographs of Antietam was, very shocking to the public, and did let people see the horrors of war, many people for the first time. Although it didn't stop the war, though, did it? Didn't
the battlefield, everybody.
Right, didn't make much difference in how the war was conducted. Didn't make any difference. Jill.
The burial places of the Confederate dead who fell at the Battle of Antietam, Monocacy, and South Mountain includes, which is also known as the Bowie list.
I'm gonna have to get closer to you to hear you.
I could also stand up and yell. The burial places of the Confederate dead who fell at the Battle of Antietam, South Mountain, and Monocacy includes a listing of a African church that was near the top of the mountain. So I think it's the same one that you're describing. And in that cemetery there were Confederates or Union, it was probably Confederates were buried in that cemetery according to the Bowie list. And as we know, that was done 12 years after the battle, et cetera, but it is worth looking at that reference, and I can send it to you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you very much. Everybody heard that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Huh, thank you.
The numbers across the top of the gravestone, I can't quite make them out here.
Sorry, what?
The numbers across the very top of the gravestone.
His there,
Yeah.
3225, I think it's just the plot number or something. Most of those tombstones, most USCT stones that I've seen in other cemeteries don't have that. So I assume it's something to do with Alexandria specifically. Burial number or plot number or something. But we have stones like that at Halfway that do not, well, we have one that does not have a number, but I've seen them at other cemeteries around because, counties, they don't have those numbers. So it's nothing to do with him.
forgive my pronunciation here. Is this named after Toussaint Louverture?
Yes, Toussaint Louverture.
Now, is that on
Louverture.
Arlington House property? Where is that located?
Yes, so, I don't know Alexandria, but.
This
what
is in Alexandria, not Arlington.
It's in Alexandria, Virginia,
Okay.
and the part of it is located, took over what had been a notorious slave trader's premises. And they used the slave pen as the jail, the lockup, because they had, I guess, they anticipated having, some disciplinary problems with.
Out there on Duke Street? Are you familiar with
I'm
that?
sorry, I do not recall what street it's on, but, if you Google Louverture Hospital, I think there was one called that in New Orleans too.
Okay.
But you'll come up with the Alexandria one and a whole lot of information.
About it. Yeah. It is named after Toussaint Louverture, who was the great hero of the Haitian Revolution, the Black Revolution in Haiti.
Thank you.
Good eye.
Oh, I'm thinking I know I can't remember their names, but they're out on Duke Street. There are two of them. And one of them's called something the Negro Jail. And then the other one, I think there's an Armistead, Franklin Armistead.
Oh, yeah, that rings a bell.
Does that ring?
That was for slave trading?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right.
In that general vicinity, maybe?
Yeah.
Okay.
But again, it's not my field of
Yeah.
much knowledge, sorry.
My senior moment is not remembering it.
Is there a hand over there? Al?
Well, I wanted to ask a question. Your background is medieval history. I know, I remember reading a story about your involvement with the Episcopal Church down in Lapland. So how did you get involved into this research in our community's Black history?
It was that pesky Episcopal Church, yeah. So I've been doing Black history in Washington County for about 12 years now. So I've kind of left medieval history behind, although I was still teaching it until I retired. It was started as a project at my church. You want to hear the story? Okay. One day at church, our rector, Ann Weatherholt, who some of you will know, in a meeting, 12 years ago, congregational meeting, she mentioned that we had a slave balcony at the church, and I was fairly new to the church at that time, and I had been in the balcony, I had sung from the balcony, I had no idea it was a slave balcony. Furthermore, she mentioned that the first people married at the church in 1849 and this was in the parish register, when the church was new, were Jeremiah and Melinda, slaves of Mr. Booth. There were slaves in this church? And she said, I've always wished someone would do research about them and learn more about them for us and maybe trace their descendants. After the meeting, I went up to her and I said, I will do that research. I would love to do that research. And that just put me on this journey, and here I am. And eventually it became a bigger project. The first thing I found out when I started the research was that every founding member of that church had been a slaveholder. Oh, that was quite the piece of information. And I found a lot about Jeremiah and Melinda. I found out, eventually I found the names of, more than 50 enslaved people who had attended our church or been owned by members of our church. And, we did a lot of work, as a congregation on that knowledge. And I found the graves of formerly enslaved people in our cemetery that nobody had known were there. Eventually, we put up historic markers. We contacted the descendants of those people who live here in Hagerstown, of the people buried at the church, not Jeremiah and Melinda. We haven't found their descendants yet, but I'm working on it. I will find little bits of information all the time. We have a stained glass window at the church now that is dedicated to the enslaved people at the church. It was installed in 2018. So, yeah, it's been a journey,
How long have you been doing the research now?
12 years.
12 years, okay.
It's my main research now. And I do a lot of different kinds of research. I've got this book coming out, but I also blog. I do genealogy with Black families to help them find their ancestors. And with Elizabeth Paul, who is sitting in the jacket that matches my shirt. Oh my goodness. We did not call each other. We are, Elizabeth lives next door to Halfway African American Cemetery, which was a lost cemetery until Elizabeth found it. And she contacted me and said, someone told me you might know about this cemetery next to my backyard. And I said, it's still there? I thought it was lost. And now it is found and it is being cleaned up with the amazing help of many volunteers and neighbors and Hood Archaeology Department and, it's less than an acre in size, but originally it was larger and hundreds of people from the Jonathan Street community were buried there between 1844 and 1932. And their graves are mostly probably built over because it was sold off. Most of it was sold off for housing, housing development. But there's a little enclave of less than an acre that is still legally cemetery. And we have found about 12 headstones, I think, still there. And so many interesting things there. And there's an exhibit out in the lobby. So hopefully after the talk, you'll go out and look at some of the things from Halfway that are there. And we hope eventually that it will be preserved and in a public way. The descendants of the people buried at Halfway will be able to come and visit it freely, and other people will be able to come and pay their respects at Halfway.
Who owns that cemetery?
That's a very good question. The Good Samaritans and Daughters of Samaria own it, but they no longer exist. But it is protected by Maryland state law. So we are working with a lawyer to clarify the ownership status of the cemetery.
I missed you saying the name of your church.
It's St. Mark's Episcopal Church, Lappins. It's at Lappins Crossroads, about 6 miles south of Hagerstown on the Sharpsburg Pike. Well, just off the Sharpsburg Pike. Sharpsburg. But yeah, it's near the dollar store now. Yeah.
You mentioned about the older brother that was shot in the foot. Anything more?
No, so,
how did he die?
So I didn't know he'd been shot in the foot, and that was how he died until I found his military records. I just knew, what Archie said was that he was wounded and he died. And I hadn't been able to find his military records because his military records are filed under Rider, not Ridout. But when I knew I was going to give this, before I published the book, I did another search for him, and I said, I've got to find him. And I finally found him, and the papers are filed under Rider, and the top few sheets are Rider, and then when you get deeper into the records, he's Ridout, And the hospital records are Ridout, so they're filed in there with him. So it's clearly him, it's James Ridout. But then when you read the medical, it's just these records are usually very sketchy, and these are pretty sketchy, but it describes that he's wounded in the foot. And that was so sad to me, because nowadays you're wounded in the foot, you do not die. But in the Civil War, a lot of people died being wounded in the foot. I assume that he got gangrene or something, or some kind of other infection. Also, he may have gotten sick. The majority of people who died at Blue Victoria Hospital died of disease. And the majority of soldiers who died in the Civil War died of disease. We think about wounds and injuries and being killed in battle, but more soldiers died of disease in the Civil War than died of wounds or being killed outright. So He went to the hospital with a wound in the foot, but we don't know exactly what killed him. But it says, died of a wound in the foot. That's what his military record says. It's very sad. Archie grew up to be a Methodist minister, not an A.M.E. minister, a Methodist minister. But he was on excellent terms with his father. It wasn't there was some kind of breach between them. So I don't know why he was in the Methodist church when his father was in an A.M.E. church, but, they were good pals. Shall we adjourn to the Western Maryland room? Okay. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to those watching on YouTube.